Part 99. Fortunate Young Gentleman. Author, Rong Xiao Rong. Chapter 982. King Huai was announced to the palace by Emperor Chen. This was no secret to those who had been paying attention to King Huai in recent days. Tang Ning is also one of these people. In the eyes of most people, King Huai disobeyed His Majesty's orders, so how could His Majesty sit idly by and ignore it? Even though Prince Huai is a prince and His Majesty's son, I don't think His Majesty will show any mercy on this matter. After all, after these days of fermentation, both the people and the officials knew very well that this matter was related to His Majesty's reputation. For an emperor who wanted to leave his name in history, there is nothing better than leaving a name in the history books. Having a good reputation is more important. Tang Ning was also a little curious, because he didn't know King Huai's plan and didn't understand why he, who had always kept a low profile, was so unusually on the opposite side of King Chen this time. I am afraid that only King Huai himself knows the answer to this question. When everyone's attention was drawn to the palace, Wei Jian re-entered the temple of Yang and said, "Your Majesty, His Royal Highness Prince Huai has arrived." Emperor Chen looked gloomy and said, "Let him come in." Wei Jian walked outside the palace, looked at King Huai, and said, "Your Highness, Your Majesty, please come in." King Huai walked into the hall, arched his body slightly and said, "My son, I have met my father." "Father," Emperor Chen looked at him and said coldly, "Do you still think of me as your father?" King Huai lowered his head and asked, "Why did my father say this?" Chen Huang looked at him and said bluntly, "You don't need to worry about the case in the criminal department." King Huai raised his head and asked, "Why?" This was the first time he looked up at Emperor Chen since he entered the palace, and it was also the first time in his life that he asked why in front of him. As a result, Chen Huang's own expression was confused for a moment, almost thinking that he had heard wrongly. Among all the princes, King Huai was not the most popular with him, nor was he the most ambitious, but he was definitely the most well-behaved. From childhood to adulthood, King Huai would never disobey his words. From King Huai's mouth, he always heard yes, father, and obey, and there was never any objection or question. At this moment, Chen Huang suddenly felt that he had never seen through the sun. For no reason, a trace of fear arose in his heart, which in turn made him angry. He forcibly suppressed the complicated thoughts in his heart and whispered, "If I tell you to stop, just stop, no matter why." King Huai looked directly at him and said, "The concubine and the empress are the wives of the father. Doesn't the father not want to know that there is something strange about their deaths?" Chen Huang said in a calm voice, "More than 20 years have passed since this incident. As for the cause of their death, the Ministry of Punishment and the Imperial Hospital have long since found out. Don't disturb their peace anymore." After saying that, he glanced at King Huai again and said, "You have already reached adulthood and it is not suitable to stay in the capital for a long time. You will go to the fiefdom from now on." King Huai looked at him and asked with a smile, "What are you afraid of, father?" Chen Huang suddenly stood up from his position and said angrily, "Go easy, what did you say?" King Huai asked, "Are you afraid that I will find out what you did with the Tang family more than 20 years ago?" Chen Huang's face turned red and he said sternly, "Shut up." With a faint smile on his face, King Huai continued to ask, "Are you afraid that I will find out that you killed your own son in order to gain the support of the Tang family, or are you afraid that I will find out that you killed your brother for the throne? Father, are you still afraid that I will know that in order to stabilize your rule, you killed concubine Yang and the queen, supported concubine Tang Hui to ascend to power, and used this to curry favor with the Tang family? You traitor, you traitor." An abnormal blush appeared on Chen Huang's face. He took a few steps back and said in a trembling voice, "Who taught you this?" King Huai shook his head and said, "I found out all this myself. It's been so long." "Father, aren't you going to admit it?" "What nonsense, Chen Huang pointed at him and said angrily, "How could I harm my son, how could I harm my wife? It's useless if you don't admit it." King Huai shook his head and said, "You have killed all the people who knew about that incident back then. You left a Marquis of Yushan as a bait to bring up your intention again. The people responsible for the incident have all been eliminated one by one. I'm afraid you didn't expect that one of them was me, right?" "Shut up." Chen Wang's fingers were trembling, and his heart was even more frightened. He shouted loudly, "Come here, come here." His voice was so loud that the Yulin guards standing outside the hall could easily hear him. However, no matter how loud he shouted, no one answered. King Huai looked at him and asked, "You have betrayed your parents and brothers, your children, your wife, and your children all your life. You probably never thought that such a day would come to you, right?" Emperor Chen's face was ashen and he asked sternly, "Treason, do you want to rebel? Is it new?" A smile appeared on King Huai's face and he said, "Brothers King Kong and King Duan have already done this, by now, it's my turn, right?" Chen Huang fell on the dragon chair, clutching his chest, breathing heavily, and said, "You are treasonous and unethical, you are treasonous and unethical. This is what you taught me. As long as you can achieve your own goals, it doesn't matter if you are treasonous or unethical." King Huai looked at him and asked, "You have done even more treasonous and unethical things, haven't you?" He walked slowly towards Emperor Chen and said, "By the way, you may not know that I knew about the rebellion of Prince Kong a long time ago. The general of the Right West Gate Guard is my man. I asked him to contact Prince Kong. I also told Tang Ning about the rebellion of Prince Kong in advance, so that you can also taste the taste of being betrayed. You. Emperor Chen's eyes were wide open, his breathing was rapid, and he looked at Prince Huai, but he couldn't say a complete sentence. King Huai looked at him and continued, "There is one more thing I want to tell you. I was the one who poisoned my father with the poison from Prince Duan and the Tang family. I don't think my father would have thought of this." Emperor Chen leaned back in his chair, his body trembling, and hissed, "Beast, you beast." King Huai looked at him expressionlessly and asked, "Isn't betrayal what my father is best at? How does it feel to be betrayed again and again?" Emperor Chen ignored him and held onto the dragon chair, shouting, "Someone, come quickly." However, no matter how loudly he shouted, there was no response from outside the palace. His body was not like before, and he soon became exhausted. He leaned back in his chair, gasping for breath. "Why don't you shout any more?" King Huai looked at him and asked with a smile, "How about I help my father?" He looked outside the palace and said calmly, "Someone." Clang. The palace door suddenly opened, and the next moment, more than 100 figures filed in from outside, standing behind King Huai, with their weapons pointed directly at Emperor Chen. Emperor Chen looked at the scene with fear in his eyes. His face flushed and he suddenly vomited blood. He said in a trembling voice, "Rebellious son, you rebellious son. Fortunate young gentleman." Author, Rong Xiao Rong. Chapter 983. All the eunuchs and maids around the temple of Yang, including Wei Jian, the chief chamberlain, were captured by the people of Yulinwei. Emperor Chen experienced the initial fear, but his face became calm. He sat on the throne, looked at the Yulin guards in the hall, and finally looked at King Huai, asking, "You must have been waiting for this day for a long time, right?" "It's been more than 10 years." King Huai looked at him with disappointed eyes and asked, "To this day, doesn't my father have any regrets?" Chen Wang's eyelids drooped slightly and he said, "Those who achieve great things must give up something." King Huai said gloomily, "Including your wife and children." Emperor Chen said without changing his expression, "If I had not made that choice back then, I would have died in the hands of others, and you would not be where you are now." King Huai looked at him, unable to hide the disappointment in his eyes, and asked, "You are still not willing to admit your mistake?" Huang Chen looked at him, with disappointment in his eyes, and sighed, I thought you were different from them, but I didn't expect you to be the same as Ming or Cheng Er. You are my sons, but you are all rebelling against me. The expression on his face was not only disappointment, but also deep sadness. Each of his three most valued sons rebelled against him and wished him to die. As an emperor and a father, how chilling is this? Emperor Chen looked at him and asked again, do you also want to be emperor? King Huai glanced at him and asked, who doesn't want to? Emperor Chen stood up from his chair, shook his head, and said, Chen State is my world, and the palace is my home. Do you really think that those little tricks you did in the palace can be hidden from me? Do you really think that I can safely let your father-in-law sit on the position of General Yulanwei? Do you really think that I don't know that the Li family is no longer in the capital? He looked at King Huai and said sternly, do you really think that I don't know that you are going to rebel? Emperor Chen looked at King Huai and asked aggressively. When he finished his last words, Lin Wei, the right feather in the palace, had already turned the weapon in his hand and pointed it at King Huai. At the same time, there was a burst of chaotic footsteps at the entrance of the temple, more Yulin guards poured in from outside, and the entire Yangsha temple was tightly surrounded. A figure quickly walked in from the outside, knelt on one knee, looked at Emperor Chen, and said loudly, Chen Xingyun came late to save me, please forgive me. Get up! Emperor Chen glanced at him, then looked at King Huai again and said, you are good at everything, but you are too young. The situation was completely reversed. King Huai stood there, his face gradually turning pale. Chen Wang's face was even uglier than his, as if his spine had collapsed. He looked at King Huai with a look of extreme disappointment and murmured, why do you all betray me? This is retribution. King Huai looked at him, with a smile on his pale face, and said, this is your retribution. Your son will betray you, your ministers will betray you, and the whole world will betray you. Emperor Chen looked at him and said, after you, no one will betray me again. King Huai looked at him, the smile on his face became brighter, he shook his head and said, no, this is just the beginning. Chen Wang's eyes sharpened and he said solemnly, what did you say? The smile on King Huai's face turned into sarcasm, and he asked, to this day, do you think this court is still yours? Do you think you still have the final say? Emperor Chen said gloomily, I am the king of a country, what is there that I cannot be the master of? King Huai just smiled slightly and said, I believe that the younger brother of King Run will be a better emperor than his father. After saying this, King Huai remained silent. Emperor Chen glanced at him, waved his hand and said, take him down. After King Huai was taken down, he stood there and fell into deep contemplation. After a moment, he looked at Wei Jian who had been rescued and was standing behind him tremblingly, and asked in a low voice, what did the last sentence he said mean? Wei Jian said in a trembling voice, old, I don't know. Emperor Chen frowned at him and said, let King Run come to see me. In addition, block the news in the palace and don't spread the news about King Huai's rebellion. Wei Jian looked pale and bowed, I obey your order. After King Kong and King Duan rebelled, they were imprisoned somewhere in the palace and were not allowed to step out of the palace. It used to be the Cold Palace, but now it has become a place of confinement for the three princes. King Huai, who followed the path of King Kong and King Duan, finally followed in their footsteps. The Yulin guards escorted King Huai through the harem and walked towards the deepest part of the palace. Brother Huai Wang, what's wrong with you? At a certain moment, a suspicious voice suddenly came from behind a palace wall. Zhao Man was lying on the wall, looking at King Huai with confusion on his face, and asked, where are you going? King Huai glanced at her, a smile appeared on his face, but without answering, he turned his head and continued walking forward. Zhao Man frowned and said dissatisfied, what? Why is brother Huai Wang ignoring me? The little palace maid next to her looked at the group of people walking further and further away, opened her mouth, and said in shock, Princess, sir, something doesn't seem right. The palace was not big, so King Huai had created such a huge battle in Yangshen Temple. Naturally, it was impossible to hide it from everyone. The little palace maid sent by Zhao Man quickly found out the truth of the matter. Rebellion. Zhao Man had a look of disbelief on his face. He grabbed the maid's wrist and asked, "You said Brother Huai Wang rebelled?" The maid's face was still pale, and she said in a trembling voice, "Yes, His Majesty Prince Huai and the right-winged guards rebelled." Fortunately, His Majesty had already noticed it and made preparations in advance. After a long time, Zhao Man came back to her senses, with a sad look on her face, and murmured, "My brother Prince Kong rebelled, my brother Prince Duan rebelled, and now even my brother Prince Huai rebelled." Father. The maid also shook her head secretly. As a father, all three sons wanted him dead. If she were His Majesty, she might as well die. What's the point of living like this? Because of the news blockade in the palace, the news of Prince Huai's rebellion was only spread in a small range and did not spread outside the palace. In the Yangshen Palace, the eunuch who went to summon Prince Run returned and bowed, saying, "Your Majesty, Prince Run is not in the palace now." "Not in?" Emperor Chen frowned and asked, "Where did he go?" The eunuch said, "I heard from the female official that His Highness went out of the palace to play with the daughters of the Wang, Zhang, and Bai families." Emperor Chen frowned even deeper and asked, "What Wang, Zhang, and Bai families, who did he go out of the palace with?" The eunuch said respectfully, "It was the daughter of Minister Zhang, the granddaughter of Prime Minister Wang, and the granddaughter of General Bai of the East Gate Guard." Emperor Chen looked outside the palace and his body shook violently. "Do you think this court is still yours? Prince Run will be a better emperor than my father. Minister Zhang, Prime Minister Wang, General Bai." At this moment, what Prince Huai had just said suddenly echoed in his ears. "Wang family, Bai family, Zhang family, Fang family." Chen Huang murmured, and suddenly took a few steps back, holding the table, slowly sat on the chair, and when he raised his head, he said in a trance, "Shangshu Province, Ministry of Revenue, Ministry of Personnel, Ministry of Rights, who else, who else?" As he murmured softly, faces began to flash before his eyes. Through the Fang family, Wang family, Zhang family, and Bai family, he actually associated countless familiar faces in front of him. The owners of these faces are all important officials in the court, forming most of the current court. All along, because there are three princes in front of him, he has regarded Prince Run as a child who has not grown up. Too many things have happened in the past 2 years, occupying most of his mind, so that he has never realized that Prince Run Zhaoyuan, his son, has gathered most of the court around him. The next moment, a face appeared in his mind again. This is a young face, always with some cynicism on his face. He is the right prime minister of the current dynasty, Tangning, his most trusted favorite, and also Prince Run's husband. At this moment, Emperor Chen suddenly woke up. It turned out that the people gathered around Prince Run were not half of the court, but one. Shengshen Palace. This is a nearly abandoned palace located deep in the Imperial Palace. General Chen Xingyun of the Zhou Guard personally escorted Prince Huai into the palace and said, "From now on, I will have to ask your highness to live here." Prince Huai smiled and said, "I lived here when I was a child, and today I am home." "Take care, your highness." Chen Xingyun glanced at him and slowly retreated to the door of the palace. At the moment when the door of the palace was closed, he lowered his head and whispered, "The fish is in the net." Luan mobile version website. You are listening to novels at Bless Up channel. Wish you happiness and luck. Please subscribe to receive new novels. How do you feel about this novel? Please like and leave a comment. Fortunate Young Gentleman. Author, Rong Xiao Rong. Chapter 984. Countless pairs of eyes in the capital were staring at King Huai. They watched him enter the palace and never came out again. Tang Ning's attention temporarily turned away from King Huai because he encountered a difficult matter. Princess Anyang just told him that Prince Fu probably already knew that he was the head of Zioan Kingdom. She didn't pay attention when she was talking to Zhao 2 days ago. She heard something moving outside and opened the window to find Prince Fu standing in the yard. I don't know how long it's been. Tang Ning had a headache, looked at her and asked, "Are you sure Prince Fu heard what you said?" Princess Anyang shook her head and said, "I'm not sure either. He doesn't seem to have changed much in the past 2 days. He hasn't asked me about it, and he hasn't done anything unusual." Tang Ning waved her hand and said comfortingly, "Then don't worry. Even if he tells His Majesty about this, it won't change anything. At most, it will just be a little troublesome." To be honest, he didn't want Emperor Chen to know his identity, but he couldn't show too much trouble at the moment, as this would make Princess Anyang fall into self-blame. Tang Ning looked at her and changed the subject. "King Huai has been in the palace for so long, why hasn't he come out yet? Why don't you go into the palace to find out?" Princess Anyang nodded and said, "I'll take a look at Xiao Man again." Before Princess Anyang returned, Tang Ning learned some shocking news. The people of the Yulin Guards raided Prince Huai's mansion, and the mansion of General Yu Yulinwei was also raided. Even though the Yulin Guards had kept a low profile, it was impossible to cover up such a thing. Prince Huai's mansion was raided, and Li's mansion was raided. This can be concluded without too much speculation. King Huai rebelled. If Emperor Chen was just dissatisfied with King Huai for holding on to things that happened 20 years ago, he would never implicate the Li family. The only explanation is that King Huai and the Li family rebelled together. Not only that, they failed. Compared with King Huai's rebellion, what Tang Ning couldn't believe even more was that he failed. Based on Tang Ning's understanding of King Huai, how could he act rashly before he was completely sure? Although the case of concubine Yang and the Queen was exposed during this period, King Huai was not the kind of person who would be affected by external objects. But thinking about it carefully, he wasn't sure. The hatred between the biological mother and the adoptive mother is right in front of her. As a normal person, it is normal for her to do some abnormal things because of this. However, King Huai may have underestimated Emperor Chen's vigilance. After experiencing the rebellion of his 2 sons, King Kong and King Duan, Emperor Chen would probably become even more suspicious than before. Successful rebellion on his territory would be even harder than reaching the sky. Tang Ning finally recovered from the news and couldn't believe it. How is this possible? Does he want to die? Bai Jin stood in the courtyard and said, "Even if he doesn't die because of the rebellion, he only has half a year to live." Tang Ning turned to look at her and asked, "What did you say?" Bai Jin said, "He was poisoned." Before Tang Ning could finish hearing Bai Jin's story, the eunuch summoned him again, and His Majesty announced that he should be admitted to the palace. Tang Ning walked into the palace and could clearly feel that the atmosphere in the palace was many times more tense than before. The moment he stepped into the imperial study room, he found that there were many people in the hall. Almost all the important ministers in the court, including the Prime Minister, the Grand Scholar Zhang, the 6 ministers, the minister, including the 16th General, are here. Apart from the morning court, His Majesty summoned so many courtiers to discuss matters at the same time. It was obvious that something big had happened. Tang Ning walked to the front of the crowd and stood side by side with Wang Xiang. Tang Ning raised her head and glanced at Chen Huang. She felt that he was older than the last time they met, and his face was extremely haggard. He had obviously suffered a serious blow. Thinking about it, 3 of his sons rebelled against him. He may not be remembered in history because of his political achievements, but he will definitely leave a mark in history because of this incident. Chen Huangzuo sat on the dragon chair, looked down, and said coldly, "King Huai has rebelled." "What? King Huai rebelled? How can this be?" After Chen Huang finished speaking, there was a gasp of air in the palace. The faces of all the officials showed extreme surprise and shock. The originally quiet palace immediately became noisy. Emperor Chen stood up from the dragon chair, and everyone immediately lowered their heads and remained silent. Emperor Chen glanced at them and said, "King Huai has conspired to rebel. From now on, he will be deprived of his position as prince, demoted to a commoner, and imprisoned in the palace for life. Do you have any objections to this?" Including Tang Ning, everyone bowed and no one raised any objection. Although King Huai rebelled, he was still the son of Emperor Chen. Tang Ning didn't know what Emperor Chen was like before, but he had become much more merciful in recent years. Although the punishment for the three rebel princes was not lightly, but they spared their lives. However, imprisoning them in the palace for a lifetime is not much better than killing them. At this moment, Emperor Chen looked at them again and said, "I thought about it carefully. King Kong, King Duan, and King Huai rebelled one after another. The biggest mistake is my fault. A country cannot be without a king for a day, nor can it be without a king for a day. There will be no crown prince in the future. I should learn from the Chu state and establish a prince as early as possible to put an end to future disputes over princes." As Emperor Chen spoke, the expressions of the officials in the palace also changed. The confirmation of the crown prince is related to the situation in the court. Because of what happened in the past few years and your Majesty's vigilance, no one dared to interrupt this matter. This time, after King Huai rebelled, is your Majesty finally determined? Emperor Chen glanced at everyone and said, "Prince Run Zhaoyuan is talented and intelligent, virtuous and honest, and deeply loved by me. I want to make him the crown prince. What do you think?" The officials in the palace lowered their heads, neither agreeing nor opposing. The matter of establishing a crown prince is of great importance, and no one dared to speak carelessly. Moreover, in the current capital, all the princes have rebelled, leaving only Prince Run without a stain on his body. Your Majesty's appointment of him as the crown prince is also within everyone's expectations. Who would object? Who dares to object? Not to mention that there is only Prince Run left among the princes. Just talking about the forces behind Prince Run, the Fang brothers are his uncles, Tang Xiang is his teacher, and Zhang Dexioxi is also his teacher. Counting the families and officials who are on good terms with these families, Prince Run's ascension is almost a foregone conclusion. After a moment of silence in the hall, an official finally stood up and bowed, saying, "Your Majesty is wise. Your Majesty is wise. Your Majesty is wise." Prince Run has already grown up, which is something everyone knows. His Majesty's decision this time is nothing more than confirming their guesses in advance. Therefore, no one in the hall objects to making Prince Run the crown prince. Emperor Chen's eyes swept across everyone's faces, and he waved his hand and said, "Since all the ministers have no objection, let's disperse." The expressions on the faces of the courtiers were different, some were shocked, and some were happy. Only Wang Xiang and Zhang Dexioxi frowned, while Fang Jie, the assistant minister of the Ministry of Revenue, who had a stake in the matter, had a blank expression on his face, and it was impossible to tell what he was thinking. Tang Ning looked at Emperor Chen, and suddenly he had a bad feeling in his heart. At this time, Emperor Chen also looked at him and said, "I will leave the matter of Prince Huai's rebellion to you. You must catch all the rebels in one fell swoop and not let any fish escape the net." Tang Ning cupped his hands and said, "I obey your order." Deep in the palace, the hall of self-reflection. Tang Ning stood in front of the palace door and said, "Open the door." Two Yolin guards opened the palace door and Tang Ning walked in. King Huai stood in the palace, slowly turned around, looked at him, and smiled, "You are here." Tang Ning asked, "Did you know I would come?" King Huai shook his head and said, "You will not feel at ease if you don't come to see me." Tang Ning did not deny it, looked at him and asked, "What did you say to His Majesty?" King Huai smiled and said, "Nothing, I just told him that the emperor's brother, Prince Run, would be a better emperor than him. Tang Ning's body was shocked. At this moment, he finally understood why Emperor Chen had such an expression when he announced that he would make Prince Run the crown prince. He didn't really want to make Prince Run the crown prince, he was testing. He was testing how many people supported Prince Run, or how many court officials the Fang family had won over. Emperor Chen might really want to make Prince Run the crown prince, but he definitely didn't want to see that Prince Run had already taken control of the court and had the ability to overthrow him before he passed on the throne. He might even change his decision to make the crown prince because of this incident. For an emperor with a strong desire for control and suspicion, he couldn't accept such a fact. Although the choice of this matter was up to Emperor Chen, it was obvious that Prince Huai knew his father very well, and Tang Ning knew him too. In other words, Prince Huai's words made the Fang family, the Prime Minister, Zhang Dexushi, and even Tang Ning all stand on the opposite side of Emperor Chen. He finally understood why Prince Huai's rebellion today did not succeed. Because he didn't want to succeed at all, he didn't want to let Emperor Chen go so easily. He wanted Emperor Chen to be betrayed by his fourth son, by the ministers he valued, and by the entire court. And Tang Ning was just a tool that he pulled into this quagmire to realize his plan. The most frustrating thing is that this is a dead end that they can no longer control after they enter the game. King Huai is still the same King Huai, planning and strategizing as before. In this matter, even the Fang family, Wang Xiang, Zhang family, countless ministers in the court, including Tang Ning himself, are his pawns. He used himself as bait to get all of them into the game. Tang Ning looked at King Huai and asked helplessly, "Tell me, is this something a human would do?" Fortunate young gentleman author, Wrong Xiao Wrong. Chapter 985. Ruyi Xiaolang Jun Text Volume 980, The Gap Between the Monarch and His Subjects. In order to take revenge, he did not hesitate to use himself as bait, and he did not hesitate to give up the throne that was within his grasp, and he also dealt a heavy blow to Emperor Chen one after another. This is really not something a normal person can do. King Huai smiled and asked, "What Lord Tang did is what a human would do." Tang Ning asked, "What do you mean?" King Huai looked into his eyes and asked, "Should I call you Lord Tang, or, Your Majesty?" Tang Ning was silent for a moment, looked at him, and asked, "Is Prince Fu also your man?" Not many people in the capital knew Tang Ning's identity. Princess Anyang and Zhao Man could not tell King Huai about this matter. Only Prince Fu, who might have heard the conversation between Princess Anyang and Pinner, could know the secret. However, he did not tell Emperor Chen about this matter, but told King Huai directly. What this meant was no longer necessary to guess. King Huai neither admitted nor denied it. He looked into the distance and said, "I have done what I should do. Now, I will leave it to you." "Leave it to us," Tang Ning snorted coldly and asked, "Do you think we will fall for your trick?" King Huai still smiled and asked, "Can you do this?" Tang Ning knew that it was not up to him, because the key to this matter was Emperor Chen. The Fang family had gathered such a large force for Zhao Yuan. This behavior was considered a betrayal in the eyes of Emperor Chen. Tang Ning believed that after experiencing the rebellion of his three sons one after another, what Emperor Chen hated most now was betrayal. He might change his decision to make Zhao Yuan the crown prince because of this incident. The Fang family and the forces behind Zhao Yuan had paved so much for his path to the crown prince, and of course they would not let Emperor Chen change his decision. So Emperor Chen stood on the opposite side of most of the important officials in the court. For their own interests, both sides would not take a step back. This was exactly what King Huai hoped for. Emperor Chen was not only betrayed by his four sons, but also by his ministers and his court. There are also innocent people involved in this matter. The family of Prince Run, who originally planned to quietly take advantage, was pushed to the front by him and had to face the most powerful person in Chen state. Tang Ning is one of the innocent people. You are really a piece of shit. Tang Ning looked at Prince Huai, shook his head and said, then a smile appeared on his face, and his tone changed, and he said, but you are a man. Tang Ning thought he was cruel enough, but in fact, Prince Huai was cruel. The cruelest revenge is not to kill the other party, but to make him live more painful than death. He wants to use this method to make Emperor Chen spend the rest of his life in pain to avenge his biological mother and adoptive mother. He must have been preparing this plan for a long time. His non-competitiveness and low-keyness were all deliberately pretended by him. As princes, Prince Kong and Prince Duan could not be compared with him at all. Tang Ning admired Prince Huai from the bottom of his heart. If the identities of the two were swapped, Tang Ning might not be as good as him. He thought of something and asked, those notes were also written by you, right? You know that Prince Kong rebelled, and you are the one standing behind Prince Duan and the Tang family, right? Prince Huai did not speak, which was already an admission. Tang Ning gave him a thumbs up and said, you are ruthless enough. King Huai looked at him, smiled slightly, and said, be careful, my father is much more ruthless than me. Tang Ning folded his arms, looked at King Huai for a few times, and asked, you don't have any backup plan, do you? King Huai asked, I am a dying man, what backup plan can I have? Tang Ning shook his head, stretched out his hand and threw him a bag of things, saying, it's a pity for you to die, save your life first. King Huai stretched out his hand to take the things thrown by Tang Ning and asked, what is this? Tang Ning said, your antidote. King Huai put the antidote aside and asked, can I ask you a question? Without waiting for Tang Ning to agree, he looked at Tang Ning and asked, has the land of Qian fallen into your hands? Tang Ning did not answer, but King Huai had already got the answer from his face. He looked at Tang Ning and continued to ask, Princess Chang Ning of Chu has married you, what is your relationship with Sushan Khan? Tang Ning glanced at him and said, this is the second question. You didn't answer the first question. King Huai smiled and asked, the last question, do you know Princess Xifen? Yangshan Palace. Emperor Chen sat on a chair, lowered his head, and looked depressed. Tang Ning walked in from outside the palace, bowed and said, Your Majesty. Emperor Chen raised his head and asked, did you find out anything? Tang Ning shook his head and said, he didn't say anything. Emperor Chen smiled self-deprecatingly and said, for so many years, I have never discovered that the person who hides the deepest around me is actually him. Tang Ning lowered his head and did not intervene. Emperor Chen slowly stood up and said, what I hate most is betrayal. Prince Kong betrayed, Prince Duan betrayed, and now even Prince Huai has betrayed me. Who else can I trust around me? Tang Ning said, all the courtiers in the palace and the common people are loyal to your majesty. Emperor Chen laughed sarcastically and said, it's not certain who they are loyal to. After a moment, the self-mockery on his face disappeared, and he looked at Tang Ning again and asked, just now in the palace, I said that I would make Prince Run the crown prince. Do you have any objections? Tang Ning looked calm and said, I think that only your majesty can decide on the appointment of the crown prince. I have no objection to your majesty's decision. Emperor Chen said, I want to hear your true thoughts. At this point, it was useless for Tang Ning to cover up. He thought for a while and said, now there is only one prince left in the capital, Prince Run. I also think that your majesty's decision is the most appropriate. Emperor Chen smiled and said, although Prince Run is the only one left in the capital, I am not the only son left with Prince Run. Tang Ning raised his head and felt that the smile on Emperor Chen's face was somewhat grim. When Emperor Chen was young, he was even more lustful than Prince Run. He did have far more than 4 sons, but the other princes had no status or background, and were not valued by him. They were sent out of the capital early, and the court officials and the people had almost forgotten their existence. At this moment, Emperor Chen mentioned this matter in front of Tang Ning, and his intention was naturally obvious. He was threatening or warning. He wanted to tell Tang Ning that he had more than one prince, Prince Run, and Prince Run was far from the end. He had the final say on who would be the crown prince. Tang Ning stood there, speechless. Emperor Chen glanced at him and said, "Nothing else, you can go down first." Tang Ning cupped his hands and said, "Your Majesty, Princess Pingyang was unwell 2 days ago. I want to see her again." Emperor Chen looked indifferent and said, "Princess Pingyang is unwell. I will arrange for the imperial physician to treat her. The Shangshu province is busy. You just need to take care of your own affairs." Tang Ning raised his head, and Emperor Chen looked over. The two looked at each other. Emperor Chen's eyes were indifferent, without a trace of emotion, while Tang Ning's eyes were deep, and no emotion could be seen. The two looked at each other, and neither spoke. But both Tang Ning and Emperor Chen knew very well that from today on, a deep and difficult-to-fill gully had appeared between the monarch and his subjects, who had never had any conflicts. After a long while, Emperor Chen looked away from him and said solemnly, "Go down." Tang Ning bowed and said calmly, "Your Highness, I will take my leave." Fortunate young gentleman. Author, Rong Xiao Rong. Chapter 986. Perhaps because of the rebellion of Prince Kong and Prince Duan within 2 years, Emperor Chen did not announce the news of Prince Huai's rebellion this time, but such a big thing could not be concealed anyway. Prince Huai's mansion was confiscated, and the mansion of the general of the right-winged guard was confiscated. The people could guess what happened even if they guessed. Prince Huai rebelled. When the people of the capital heard the news, in addition to deep pity for Prince Huai, they also felt sad for Emperor Chen. It was sad that his sons turned against him, and it was sad that he sacrificed his wife and children for the throne more than 20 years ago, and now he finally got retribution. When Prince Kong and Prince Duan rebelled, the people all denounced it, but when most people talked about Prince Huai's rebellion in private this time, they just sighed. How could they blame a son whose original intention was just to avenge his mother? Unfortunately, he failed in the end. Since ancient times, the supreme position can only be held by cold-blooded and ruthless people. If Prince Huai failed to rebel, he would have to spend the rest of his life in confinement. Not long after Tang Ning left the palace, he heard some news one after another. Because of the rebellion of King Huai and the right-winged guard, Emperor Chen completely replaced the entire right-winged guard and temporarily transferred 5,000 people from the 16 guards to form a new right-winged guard. The right-winged guard has no leader for the time being, and is led by General Chen Xingyun of the left-winged guard, who made great contributions in quelling King Huai's rebellion. In addition, he also issued a house arrest order to Zhao Man, strictly prohibiting her from leaving the harem, and not allowing anyone to visit her. Even Princess Anyang could not enter the palace to see her. This was a disguised house arrest for her, and Tang Ning knew that all this was done for him to see. In addition, some major changes also took place in the court. For several important official positions in the court, Emperor Chen promoted some officials who were not qualified and old enough, and also made some adjustments to existing positions. Fang Jie, the Assistant Minister of the Ministry of Revenue, was transferred to the Ministry of Personnel as an Assistant Minister. The Assistant Minister of the Ministry of Revenue and the Assistant Minister of the Ministry of Personnel are in charge of money and power respectively, and their status in the 6 ministries is equal. To be honest, the status of the Assistant Minister of the Ministry of Personnel is even more transcendent. This seems to be a horizontal transfer, but there is a great meaning behind it. Fang Hong is the Minister of Personnel, and Fang Jie is the Assistant Minister of the Ministry of Revenue. The Fang brothers originally had a say in both the Ministry of Personnel and the Ministry of Revenue. Now that Fang Jie has been transferred to the Ministry of Personnel, the Fang family has lost its influence in the Ministry of Revenue. On the contrary, the Ministry of Personnel, because Fang Hong was originally the minister, Even if Fang Zhe was transferred there, it would not be icing on the cake, but just lost the Ministry of Revenue for no reason. At the same time, Emperor Chen also adjusted the defense duties of the East Gate Guard. The right East Gate Guard, which was originally closer to the city gate, swapped positions with the left East Gate Guard. Zhang Yan, the Minister of Rights, is about to be transferred to the Minister of Works. Although his official position remains unchanged, the Ministry of Rights is nominally the head of the 6 ministries, and the influence of the Minister of Works is far less than that of the Minister of Rights. Many people speculate that these unusual transfers made by His Majesty must be related to the rebellion of King Huai, but no matter how they think, they can't figure out any connection between these things, let alone guess His Majesty's purpose. Tang Ning knows very well why Emperor Chen made these moves. Without making a big move, he weakened the power behind King Run to the greatest extent, and King Huai's goal was achieved. When Fang Xinyu came to play with Xiao Xiao, she brought Tang Ning a letter. Obviously, the Fang family has also noticed something wrong. After King Huai rebelled, the current emperor's attention finally focused on the Fang family. There is no doubt that Emperor Chen's series of suppress ions against the Fang family is just the beginning. With his character and methods, he will gradually disintegrate the huge energy gathered by the Fang family in the following time. He said that he would make Prince Run the crown prince, but there was no further news. He had already issued an edict to recall a prince. If it were not for Emperor Chen's edict, Tang Ning would not even know that there was a loyal prince in Chen state. At such a sensitive time, Emperor Chen recalled this prince who most people had never heard of and whose presence was extremely low. The implication is very obvious. He is warning the Fang family, Tang Ning, and everyone behind Prince Run that he is still the emperor of Chen state. If the throne is not passed to Prince Run, it can be passed to some other prince. For Tang Ning, it doesn't make much difference whether Prince Run is the emperor or Prince Zhong is the emperor. He just wants to take Zhao Man away. Who is the emperor is the business of Chen state itself. Even though Zhao Yuan and he were in the name of master and apprentice, Tang Ning did not think that he could become a good emperor. Chen state might have a good future in the hands of King Huai. Besides, under the current situation, without a heroic emperor, Chen state would only be in a more difficult situation in the future. The Fang family and Wang Xiang suggested to wait and see. After all, if they wanted to achieve the goal of letting King Run succeed to the throne by forcing the emperor to abdicate, they would not wait until today. No one wants to be labeled as a traitor. They hope that Emperor Chen can be more conscious and proactive. Even if Emperor Chen is the emperor, he will not suppress King Run and the Fang family in a short time. The harder he tries, the greater the rebound. Emperor Chen will not fail to understand this truth and will not accept such an outcome. His usual method is to boil a frog in warm water, using a not-so-violent method to achieve his ultimate goal little by little, step by step, just like he did to the Tang family before. My father-in-law came back from the Shangshu province today, with a trace of worry between his eyebrows. Tang Ning asked and found out that a young right chancellor had just arrived in the Shangshu province. Although he was new, his methods were extremely sharp. In the absence of Tang Ning and Wang Xiang, he only took 1 day to win over half of the Shangshu province. Even a new official cannot start so fast. Tang Ning did not believe that this person did not have the instructions of Emperor Chen. Emperor Chen's actions were faster than he thought. It seemed that not only the Shangshu province, but other departments in the court would soon be purged by Emperor Chen. Tang Ning walked out of the moon gate and saw a person standing in the yard. Fang Xinyu turned around, looked at Tang Ning and asked, "Daddy, Uncle, and Uncle Emperor, what happened to them?" Tang Ning touched her head and said, "Children should not ask about adult matters." Fang Xinyu looked up at him and asked, "Are they going to rebel?" "They want cousin Zhao Yuan to be the emperor, but didn't Uncle Emperor say that he wanted to make cousin the crown prince? What happened to them?" Tang Ning opened his mouth, not knowing how to explain to her. Fang Xinyu lowered her head, feeling a little disappointed, and turned to walk out of the yard. Tang Ning gave Xiao Xiao a look, and Xiao Xiao quickly followed him out. Tang Ning sighed. There were some things she might not understand. The Fang family, including herself, did have a period of happy getting along with Emperor Chen, but now, they have had major differences and can never go back to the past. To this day, the capital seems to be relatively peaceful, but the Chen Emperor and the Runhuang faction are already at loggerheads, and only a fuse is needed to completely ignite the conflict. A sound of footsteps came from outside the courtyard. Before Tang Ning turned back, a voice came from the door. "You beast, Princess Anyang really couldn't escape your clutches." Tang Ning turned around, looked at the figure standing at the door of the courtyard, and smiled. "You're back." Xiaoju nodded and said solemnly, "I'm back." You are listening to novels at Bless Up channel. Wish you happiness and luck. Please subscribe to receive new novels. How do you feel about this novel? Please like and leave a comment. Fortunate Young Gentleman. Author, Rong Xiao Rong. Chapter 987. The remaining forces of the Black Barbarians no longer need the help of the three-nation coalition to clear them. In the next period of time, the Wanyan tribe will lead the Sushan tribe to end this old enemy. After the Black Barbarians were defeated, Chen Chu and the coalition forces in the western regions also retreated to their respective countries. Xiaoju led the army back to the court. The 100,000-strong army is now stationed outside the capital, waiting for the court's commendation and reward. Tang Ning looked at Xiaoju and said, "Prince Huai rebelled." I know. Xiaoju nodded and said, "Now it's my turn." The people of the capital all know that the case of the royal family more than 20 years ago was closely related to Prince Huai, because concubine Yang was Prince Huai's biological mother and the queen was Prince Huai's adoptive mother, but everyone overlooked an important fact, that is, the queen's surname was Xiao. In addition to being Prince Huai's adoptive mother, she is also the biological sister of General Xiaoju, the general of the West Gate Guard, and the daughter of General Xiao. During this period, the capital was in turmoil because of this incident, but the Xiao family remained silent until Xiaoju, who was ordered to reinforce the grassland, came back. Tang Ning looked at him and asked, "Have you thought about it?" Xiaoju said seriously, "I want to seek justice for my sister." Tang Ning patted his shoulder and said, "Then do it, leave the rest to me." The situation in the court is very tense, and it can be roughly divided into three factions recently. One faction is naturally the current emperor and the new nobles in the court who were quickly promoted by him. The other faction is the Fang family, headed by the two prime ministers. The last faction is the neutral party that has not taken sides, including Song Yi, the Minister of Punishment, Qianchuo, the Minister of Revenue, Lu Ding, the Minister of War, and the Ling family of the Golden Feather Guard. In terms of power alone, the neutral party has the largest number of people and the most powerful power. The Fang family faction weakened by the emperor is weaker than him. As for the current emperor, it is the weakest. Although he is the king of a country, the affairs of the court have never been judged by the status. An emperor who has almost no control over the court cannot be considered a real emperor. This is also the reason why the neutral faction is reluctant to stand by Emperor Chen. Xiaoju left the Tang family and Tang Ning went to the Song family. He stayed at the Song family for a whole hour. When he left, the brothers Song Yi and Song Qian personally saw him out the door. Watching Tang Ning's figure go away, Song Yi, the Minister of Justice, sighed and said, "How did things get to this point?" Song Qian asked, "How to choose?" "It's hard to choose." Song Yi shook his head and said, "If we are not careful, our Song family will be doomed." Song Qian said, "If we don't choose, His Majesty will not let us go." Song Yi thought for a long time, then smiled helplessly and said, "Then the Song family can only be a flatterer for once." Song Qian smiled and said, "Don't worry, this flatterer will never be the Song family's turn." After Tang Ning left the Song family, he went to the Ling Mansion, the Han Mansion, and the Qian Mansion, and did not return home until the evening. At the same time, the Xiao family. Xiaoju knelt in the hall, lowered his head, and said nothing. Old Master Xiao looked at him and asked, "Are you really going to do that treasonous thing?" Xiaoju said, "I just want the truth." Old Master Xiao asked in a deep voice, "Are you willing to rebel for this?" Xiaoju lowered his voice and said, "He harmed my sister, so what if I rebel?" Old Master Xiao looked at him for a long time, and the solemn expression on his face disappeared. He smiled and said, "You have grown up, and you will make your own decisions about the affairs of the Xiao family in the future." Xiaoju knelt on the ground, kowtowed several times, and walked out without looking back. Lu Ya held a swaddling cloth in her arms, looked at him, and said, "Dad asked you to go to the Lu family." Xiaoju took the swaddling cloth from her arms, teased the baby for a few times, gently held her hand, and said, "Let's go." In recent days, the situation in the capital has been tense, the court has become a mess, and the people are also panic-stricken. The army led by General Xiao helped Sushan and defeated the black barbarians, and returned with a great victory, which finally brought a little relief to this tense atmosphere. In the imperial study, the gloomy mood of Emperor Chen eased a little. Looking at Xiaoju, he smiled and said, "Thank you for your hard work." Xiaoju cupped his hands and said, "This is my duty." This time, Chen State sent troops to the grassland to help the Sushan tribe, which is of great significance. It not only improved the relationship with the Sushan tribe, but also eased the relationship with the western regions. In this way, the foreign threat of Chen State was finally eliminated. It was the most stable period on the border since the founding of Chen State. Emperor Chen looked at Xiaoju and said, "You have made such a great contribution. I don't know how to reward you for a while. Tell me yourself, what reward do you want?" Xiaoju slowly raised his head, looked at Emperor Chen, and said, "I would like to ask your majesty to thoroughly investigate the death of my sister Empress Xiao more than 20 years ago." Emperor Chen was shocked. When he looked at him, his eyes gradually became colder and asked, "Even you want to go against me?" Xiaoju said, "I just want the truth." This matter has become a thorn in Emperor Chen's heart, a thorn that no one else can touch. "Get out," Emperor Chen looked at him and said angrily, "Get out of here." Xiaoju did not say anything more, bowed and said, "I'll leave." As Xiaoju left, Emperor Chen smashed the teacup hard on the ground and said sternly, "Do they all want to rebel? Why do they all force me?" Wei Jian stood behind him and sighed silently. An eunuch walked in cautiously from outside, holding a stack of memorials in his arms, and said, "Your Majesty, the memorials from the Ministry of Shangshu have been delivered today." Emperor Chen no longer cares about court affairs, but the Ministry of Shangshu still sends some important memorials on weekdays. He held his forehead and whispered, "What's written on it?" The eunuch opened a memorial, raised his head, and said, "Prime Minister Wang requests your Majesty to thoroughly investigate the old case of concubine Yang and the queen who were 20 years old." Emperor Chen's body trembled, clenched his fists, raised his head suddenly, and said coldly, "Next." The eunuch opened a new one and whispered, "Prime Minister Tang requests your Majesty to thoroughly investigate." Emperor Chen's voice became even colder, "Next." The little eunuch trembled and said, "Minister Fang Hong of the Ministry of Personnel, Vice Minister Fang Jia of the Ministry of Personnel." Emperor Chen looked at him suddenly and gritted his teeth and said, "Who else? Read it out to me." The little eunuch opened one memorial after another, and his voice trembled even more, "Minister of Works Zhang Yan, Vice Minister Zhang Hao, Minister of Revenue Qianchuo, Vice Minister Sun Qian, Minister of War Lu Ding, Vice Minister Nai Qian, Zhou Hai, Minister of Punishment Song Yi, Chief Justice of Jiangyi Province Song Qian, Doctor of the Left Secretariat Zhong Mingli, General of the Left Golden Feather Guard, Marquis of Wuli Hanwei, General of the right Golden Feather Guard Ling Wu. General of the left Xiao Ei Guard Chenzhou, General of the right East Gate Guard Baiyu, request your majesty to thoroughly investigate the deaths of Empress Xiao and concubine Yang. The little eunuch read out dozens of names in a trembling voice. All of these names were high-ranking officials of the court above the fourth rank, almost covering 7 or 8 out of 10 high-ranking officials in the court. Empress Chen took a few steps back and collapsed on the chair, and the words of King Huai rang in her ears again. Your son wants to betray you, your ministers want to betray you, and the whole world wants to betray you. His son has already betrayed him, his ministers have also betrayed him, and King Huai's words have been mostly confirmed. The people will not betray me. Even though he is the emperor, he cannot fight against most of the court alone. Emperor Chen looked at the memorials one by one, his face finally turned pale, and he closed his eyes powerlessly. After a long time, he slowly opened his eyes, his lips trembled, and he said, Wei Jian, draft an edict, I want to see if they really want to rebel. Fortunate Young Gentleman. Author, Rong Xiao Rong. Chapter 988. There is always no shortage of sensational news in the capital these days. Not long after King Huai's rebellion, His Majesty issued an imperial edict admitting the mistakes he had committed more than 20 years ago. As soon as this news came out, the capital was in an uproar. The Xinji Edict is a kind of oral edict or document issued by the emperor to reflect on himself or review his own faults and mistakes. Throughout the dynasties, few emperors would issue such a thing. As the king of a country, how could the emperor make mistakes? How could he admit that he had made mistakes? Emperors who can face up to their mistakes all have a broad mind. At this point, the old case that the original King Huai and now Xiaoju asked for finally came to an end. When Tang Ning first heard the news, she was shocked for a while before accepting the fact. It is not Chen Wang's character to admit his mistakes, nor is it his character to issue an edict to punish himself, but this is the most effective trick he uses to break the situation. When people or officials commit crimes, they have their own laws to punish them. If the emperor commits a crime, he can just issue an edict to punish him. In this world, after making a mistake, there are only women and emperors who can easily cover up the past with "I've already apologized, what else do you want?" No one can punish him except the emperor himself. Xiaoju and the Fang family were able to force Emperor Chen to issue an imperial edict and admit his mistakes, but if they dared to force Emperor Chen to abdicate, that would be a rebellion. Regardless of whether they succeeded or not, they would leave an indelible stain in the history books. After this crime has been punished, no one can bring up this old case from more than 20 years ago, even if it is completely solved. This was an explanation for Xiaoju and King Huai, but that was the end of it. However, Tang Ning knew that for Chen Huang, this was just the beginning. After this incident, the game between the emperor and his ministers would officially begin. Shengshen Palace. Emperor Chen looked at King Huai and asked, "Are you satisfied?" King Huai sat quietly on the chair, neither looking at him nor speaking. "But I'm not satisfied yet." Emperor Chen's eyes gradually turned cold and he said, "I didn't expect that the Zhao family's court was already firmly controlled by these people. The 2 prime ministers and 5 ministers were all. If you want to force me to admit my mistake, I, as the emperor, would be really frustrated." King Huai looked up at him, shook his head, and said, "Father, I still don't think you are wrong." "What's my fault?" Emperor Chen stared at him and asked, "Since ancient times, those who are soft-hearted have not been able to achieve great things. My fault was that I did not discover the signs in the court early, which led to today's sycophantic ministers and chaos. Disaster." King Huai said calmly, "There is a certain destiny. Sooner or later, the sins you have committed will be paid back in double amounts." Chen Huang stood up, glanced at him coldly, and said, "I have already paid back what I should have paid, and now it's their turn." King Huai smiled slightly and said nothing more. Emperor Chen glanced at him, walked out of the Shengshen Hall, came to the imperial study room, and said, "Summon the envoy Zioan to see him." Half an hour later, envoy Zioan appeared in the imperial study, bowed to Emperor Chen, and said, "I have met His Majesty the Emperor." Emperor Chen looked at the three of them and said, "The envoy is exempt from courtesy." One of the envoys raised his head and asked, "Why has your Majesty summoned us?" Emperor Chen looked at them and said, "For Princess Pingyang and the marriage to the western regions." The envoy looked stunned and asked, "Isn't the person marrying Princess Anyang?" Emperor Chen looked calm and said, "In order to show the sincerity of our country, Chen, I am willing to marry both princesses." The three envoys were stunned at the same time, raised their heads and asked, "Is this okay?" Emperor Chen glanced at them and said, "How can my golden words be false?" The three envoys looked at each other, bowed at the same time, and said loudly, "Thank you, His Majesty the Emperor." Emperor Chen looked at them and said, "Get ready to send your bride off today." After the three Zioan envoys left, Emperor Chen was silent for a moment, looked at Wei Jian and said, "Let Tang Ning come to see me." Emperor Chen issued an edict to take over the old cases that King Huai and Xiaoju wanted to investigate. Next, if nothing unexpected happens, he will ask the other faction to take action. Fang Hong, Wang Xiang, and others naturally had to take corresponding countermeasures. Fang Hong sent someone to invite Tang Ning to discuss matters, but Tang Ning refused. He looked at the housekeeper of the Fang mansion and said, "Tell Mr. Fang that they can make their own decisions regarding Prince Run from now on." Queen Xiao's case was the last thing Tang Ning did to help Xiaoju. From now on, no matter what the Fang family's plans were, it had nothing to do with him. Not long after the housekeeper of the Fang mansion left, Wei Jian appeared in front of Tang Ning. He looked at Tang Ning with a complicated expression and sighed, "Prime Minister Tang, Your Majesty wants to see you." In the imperial study, Tang Ning walked in slowly, and Wei Jian closed the door from the outside. There was only one figure in the hall, with his back to Tang Ning and his hands behind his back. Tang Ning bowed her hands and said, "I see Your Majesty." Emperor Chen turned around, looked at him with bright eyes, and asked, "Do you still think that I am the emperor?" Without waiting for Tang Ning's answer, he asked in a deep voice, "Is your next plan to force me to abdicate? In the future, you will be both the prime minister and the emperor's master. Will your status be much higher than your current position?" Tang Ning raised her head and said, "I would like to resign. Please give me your permission." "You want to resign?" Chen Huang looked at him and asked, "You are only one step away from success. You said you want to resign." "Not us." Tang Ning shook his head and said, "Whether it's the prime minister or the imperial master, I never cared." Emperor Chen looked into his eyes and saw a clearness. He retracted his gaze, finally lowered his head, and asked dejectedly, "Do you also think I'm wrong?" Tang Ning looked at him and said, "Your Majesty has the answer in your heart." "I'm not wrong." A trace of self-doubt first appeared on Emperor Chen's face, and then he became firm and said, "Without my choice back then, there would be no me today. I am the emperor, how could I be wrong?" When he said the last two sentences, his voice was already a little hysterical. Tang Ning stood there quietly, silent. After a long time, Emperor Chen looked at him and said, "You want to resign?" "I agree." Tang Ning bowed and said, "Thank you, Your Majesty. I have never treated you unfairly, but you have failed me in the end." Emperor Chen looked at him and said disappointedly, "I have promised Zioan's envoy to let Pingyang and Anyang marry Zioan together. This is the price you pay for betraying me." Tang Ning did not know about this from the envoy, and it seemed that this happened just now. He stood up straight, bowed to the bottom, and said, "Thank you, Your Majesty." Tang Ning's performance was not what he expected at all. Emperor Chen frowned and said, "Thank you for what?" Tang Ning raised his head, smiled, and said, "Thank you, Your Majesty, for your cultivation over the years." I will take my leave. Seeing Tang Ning's back disappearing, Emperor Chen suddenly spoke. Stay. He stared at Tang Ning and said, power, beauty, whatever you want, I will give you. The court needs you, and I need you too. Tang Ning paused, turned around slowly, bowed deeply to Emperor Chen again, and then walked out of the hall without looking back. Emperor Chen looked at Wei Jian, who came in from outside, and asked, am I really wrong? Wei Jian stood quietly behind him without any reaction, like a reef. After a long while, Emperor Chen looked outside the hall and said lightly, we are a monarch and a minister. Since he insists on leaving, I will send him off. Fortunate young gentleman. Author, Rong Xiao Rong. Chapter 989. When Tang Ning returned home, he received the letter secretly sent by the Zioan envoy. Before summoning him, Emperor Chen also summoned them and proposed the idea of marrying Princess Pingyang Zhaoman to the western regions, and the Zioan envoy readily agreed. Tang Ning naturally knew that this was Emperor Chen's revenge on him, because Tang Ning did not stand on his side in the old case of Empress Xiao. Emperor Chen was still the ruthless emperor. In his eyes, his children and wives were never as good as power, and could only become tools for him to vent his anger and revenge. However, Emperor Chen could not have thought that Tang Ning was the ruler of Zioan. Originally, he needed to spend some effort to take Xiao Man away, but now all this is natural. As for what happened later, Tang Ning didn't want to care, and he couldn't care. An important reason is that this court is no longer a court where Emperor Chen has the final say. The Fang family and Wang Xiang and others have reached a consensus that as long as Emperor Chen continues to suppress, he, the emperor, will be completely sidelined. Su Mei received news that not long ago, the former Liang court had been completely infiltrated by several elders, and the situation in the capital was also determined. In a few days, the state of Chen will send people to escort the envoy Zioan away, and the two princesses will leave with them. Xiao Xiao and Fang Xinyu were talking in the yard. Tang Ning stood at the door, looked at her, and said, pack up your things early, we will leave in 2 days. After Tang Ning left, Fang Xinyu looked at Xiao Xiao and asked, you are leaving again, where are you going? Xiao Xiao said, brother said he would go to Jiangnan first. Fang Xinyu lowered her head and asked, are you coming back? Xiaoxiao's expression was a little depressed, and she whispered, I probably won't come back after leaving this time. I'll see you off when you leave. Fang Xinyu stood up and said, I'll go back first. Fang family. After the rebellion of King Huai, the Fang family was unexpectedly pushed to the forefront of the chaos in the capital. Although the Fang family was unprepared for this, they had accumulated a lot of experience in the past 2 years, so they were not too passive. However, it is a fact that the Fang family and His Majesty are on opposite sides. This opposition will sooner or later evolve into a more intense conflict. The Fang family can no longer keep a low profile in the entire court as before. These days, His Majesty has recalled King Zhong and started to cultivate new wings. If the Fang family does not move, the end will be extremely miserable. And with their current strength, they can completely force His Majesty to abdicate. It's just that the Fang family is unwilling to bear the stigma. Fang Hong is an upright person. Even if he secretly supports King Run, he has never used any extreme means. For him, he still cannot accept the fact that the Fang family and His Majesty are in opposition. Fang Jie said calmly, there is no right or wrong in these things. The winner is the king and the loser is the bandit. When the Fang family made that decision, they should have expected that this day would come sooner or later. Fang Hong said, but this is a rebellion. Fang Jie said, throughout the ages, the struggle for the throne has always been like this. Fang Hong sighed and said, I am stupid. Please worry more about Prince Run's affairs in the future, my fourth brother. Outside the study, a figure hiding in the corner eavesdropped, with a complex and painful expression on his face. There have been so many major events in the capital in recent days that no one is so surprised when there is any shocking news. Prince Huai rebelled, and the court officials in the palace reported to the emperor, forcing him to thoroughly investigate the case of Queen Yangfei, and he issued a self-criticism edict. In addition, His Majesty suddenly married the two princesses Anyang and Pingyang to the western regions, and the Prime Minister of Tang resigned. These were all major events that people could not have guessed. Compared with this, the news that Shang Shizuokan Zhonmingli resigned was not worth mentioning at all. The delegation that sent the bride out of the capital half a month ago will soon enter the border of the western regions. The Chen kingdom married two princesses at once, and its sincerity is evident. This represents that the relationship between the Chen kingdom and the western regions has made unprecedented progress. At the city gate, several carriages were parked on the official road. The old beggar was leaning on the carriage and taking a nap. Old Zheng and the middle-aged woman were squatting in the grass, holding Fang Xinyu's hand with reluctance in their eyes. Farther away, Xiaozhu looked at Tang Ning and said, "After I finish the things in the capital, I don't want to stay here." Tang Ning patted his shoulder and said, "See you then." Xiaozhu looked at him and suddenly said, "Thank you." Tang Ning lightly punched him on the shoulder and waved, "Let's go." He said goodbye to Xiaozhu, and when he turned around, a figure suddenly came over from the crowd, put a note in his hand, and left in a hurry. Tang Ning took a look at the man and found that he was thin, white, and beardless. He walked with his head down and his steps were fast. He looked a little feminine. He should be a eunuch. He opened the note in his hand and there were two words written on it. "Be careful." Looking at the note that was obviously a reminder, Tang Ning smiled, and Wei Jian's old face appeared in his mind. Then the smile on his face disappeared, and he became a little sad. He crumpled the note into a ball, got on the carriage, and said, "Let's go." The carriage was moving at a fast speed. In half a day, it was already far away from the capital. Lao Zheng held the reins, and the carriage slowly stopped. He rode on the horse and looked at the dense forest in front. The old beggar and the little nanny jumped off the two carriages and walked towards the dense forest. Old Zheng sat steadily on the horse. After a while, the old beggar came out of the forest carrying a figure. The old beggar threw the man to the ground and said, "There is an ambush in the forest, half of them are archers." The dog emperor actually has no mercy at all. Tang Ning looked at the spy leader with whom she had met several times and asked, "Did His Majesty send you here?" The spy leader looked at him with a wry smile on his face and said, "Why did Prime Minister Tang ask questions knowingly?" In fact, Tang Ning didn't need Wei Jian to remind him that Emperor Chen would not let him go so easily. After all, he can even kill his own wife and children, let alone his own foreign minister who has no effect on him anymore. However, guesses are just guesses. From the bottom of her heart, Tang Ning was still unwilling to accept this result. "Your Majesty asked me to ask Prime Minister Tang a question before killing him. It seems unnecessary now." The spy leader looked at him and said, "Comrade, I hope Mr. Tang will give me a good time." Tang Ning looked at him and asked, "What are you talking about?" The spy leader said, "Your Majesty asked your subordinates to ask Mr. Tang, why do you want to leave?" Tang Ning smiled and said, "Because I want to go back and inherit the throne. Nourish the temple." The spy leader knelt on the ground and said, "I have failed your Majesty's entrustment. Please punish me." Chen Huang asked in a gloomy voice, "Did they run away?" The spy leader said, "Your Majesty, we are no match for them." If it weren't for the fact that there was no one available around him, the spy leader in front of him would have been dragged out and executed long ago. Emperor Chen gave him a cold look and said, "Get down." The spy leader raised his head, moved his lips, and said, "Your Majesty, I have one more thing to report." Chen Huang said in a dark voice, "What's the matter?" The spy leader licked his dry lips and said, "Prime Minister Tang, he is the Lord of Zioan, the lord of the western regions. Chen Wang's body shook violently, as if he was struck by lightning, and he trembled. What did you say? The spy leader repeated, Prime Minister Tang is the lord of Zioan. Chen Huang leaned back on his chair, recalling the last meeting with Tang Ning in his mind, and finally understood what his thank you meant. His lips trembled, his body trembled, and he gritted his teeth and said, It's you, it's you. He had never been deceived like this, and he had never been as angry as he was now. Tang Ning had betrayed him, and he actually married both princesses to him. The delegation sent by Chen Guo to send her relatives was probably about to arrive in the western regions. There was only anger in his heart, his eyes were full of bloodshot eyes, he was breathing heavily, and said sternly, Pass my order, order 300,000 troops to garrison in the northwest, and conquer the western region. You are listening to novels at Bless Up channel. Wish you happiness and luck. Please subscribe to receive new novels. How do you feel about this novel? Please like and leave a comment. Fortunate Young Gentleman. Author, Rong Xiao Rong. Chapter 990. Without consulting the ministers, His Majesty suddenly ordered the 300,000 troops garrisoned in the northwest to attack the western region with all their strength. By the time the ministers learned the news, the spies who had been rushing for 800 miles had already left the capital and could not stop them from returning. When the courtiers and people heard the news, they were all shocked. His Majesty has just married the two princesses to the western regions, and now he is afraid that the wedding party has not yet arrived in the western regions. He has also issued an order for the border troops to attack the western regions with all their strength. It seems that he will not give up until the countries of the western regions are flattened. This is not something a rational emperor can do. Crazy. This is everyone's evaluation of today's world. The relationship between Chen State and the western regions has greatly eased. Just a few months ago, they jointly sent troops to quell the black barbarians. Now they are even related by marriage. What is the reason and what kind of stimulation did your Majesty receive? To do such a crazy thing? The courtiers wanted to remonstrate, but His Majesty closed the palace gate and saw no one. The border troops only acted according to His Majesty's military symbols and without His Majesty's imperial edict. Even if they sent people to the northwest, it would be of no avail. Everyone can see how determined His Majesty is in attacking the western region this time. For a time, the situation in Beijing became even more chaotic, and the news that Emperor Chen had sent troops to the western region seemed to have wings, spreading farther away. In Xiao Mansion, Xiao Ju was holding his little daughter in his arms. When he heard the news, he twitched the corners of his mouth and continued to tease the child with his head down. In the imperial palace, Shengshen Hall, King Huai opened the door and whispered, It's over. Chen Xingyun, who was already the head of the Yulin guards, stood beside him and asked, Your Highness, the princess and the others have been settled. Do you want to leave the capital? King Huai bent down and got on the sedan, lowered the curtain and said, Let's go. After leaving the capital, Tang Ning didn't know that Emperor Chen had decided to send troops to the western regions. He looked at a carriage behind him with a puzzled expression on his face. It was a small carriage. Ever since they left the capital, she had been hiding in the sedan and did not come out. She even took her meals into the sedan, and her appetite was obviously more than before. Her strange behavior quickly caught Tang Ning's attention. He jumped off the carriage and walked slowly towards the back. Xiao Xiao, are you okay? Tang Ning opened the sedan curtain and asked in surprise. The next moment, her expression changed. She looked at Fang Xinyu, who was sitting side by side with Xiao Xiao in the sedan, and said in shock, Xiao Xiao you, why are you here? Fang Xinyu looked at him awkwardly, stuck out her tongue, and said, Brother Tang Ning, what a coincidence. Fang Mansion. Fang Zhe held a letter in his hand and looked a little ugly. He looked at the maid in Fang Mansion and asked, When did the young lady leave? The maid lowered her head, almost crying, and said, yesterday, last night, the lady didn't come back. I thought she stayed at the Tang family again. Fang Hong came over, looked at Fang Jie, shook his head, and said, Xiao Yu has a sense of herself. She should have left with Tang Xiang. The capital is not peaceful these days, so she might as well leave. Fang Jie put down the letter, his expression changed for a long time, and finally he just sighed. Fang Hong looked at him and asked, why did your majesty suddenly send troops to the western regions? Fang Jie shook his head and said, I don't know, but I can't see clearly about this matter. Fang Hong couldn't see clearly either. He was silent for a while and said, King Huai has disappeared. It's expected. Fang Jie was not surprised at all and said, how could a person like him not have any backup plans? If my guess is correct, Chen Xingyun is also one of his, right? Fang Hong nodded and said, General Chen Xingyun of Yulanwei disappeared with him. One thing I can't figure out is that since he clearly has the ability to rebel, why would he still act like this? Fang Jie shook his head and said, for revenge. Fang Hong asked, then why did he leave? Since Chen Xingyun is his, he can leave early. It means that his goal has just been achieved. Fang Jie thought for a while and said, what is his goal? After Chen Guo announced that he would send troops to the western regions, the Northwest Frontier Army saw the military symbols and immediately began preparations for the war. At the same time, the western regions, grasslands, Chu State, and Guizhou Province also received news one after another. Western region, Xiaoan City. Several officials looked at Mr. Su and asked, Prime Minister, what should we do if the king is not here? It's about the dignity of the western region. I don't think the king will be timid. If he wants to fight, we will fight. Mr. Su looked calm and said, send someone to bring the two princesses back and declare war on Chenguo. Grassland, Wanyan Department. The Sushan tribe, which had defeated the black barbarians and was just short of completely wiping out the remaining black barbarian forces, has now become the real masters of the grassland. Wanyan Yan, who had become somewhat majestic, sat in the tent, her pretty face covered with frost, looked at Aina, and said, reorganize the troops and horses, send troops to win the state. Chu State, Kyoto. Emperor Chu was flipping through a letter in his hand, shaking his head and saying, I just married my daughter, and we are about to start a war again. Is Mr. Zhao Zheng confused? A middle-aged man stood below and said, Chen Guo's move may change the situation of other countries. We might as well wait and see what happens. Before he finished speaking, a eunuch ran in quickly and said loudly, Your Majesty, it's bad, the eldest princess is heading to Fengzhou with an army of 100,000 people. Yunnan land. The emperor of Haoliang looked at the woman sitting on the throne with a face that could charm all living beings, but there was only fear in his heart, and he said, I was also bewitched by a traitor. From now on, the wells of Dian and Qian are not in conflict with each other, and I will never interfere with you and Guizhou. How about earth affairs? Su Mei looked at the glorious palace, shook her head and said, Don't forget, this palace is not yours in the first place. When the emperor of Haoliang thought of the unbearable extreme pain, sweat poured down his forehead, and he immediately said, Whatever you want, I will listen to you. Su Mei crumpled the secret paper in her hand and said, I want you to send troops to Chen State. Chenguo, the capital. The order to attack the western region has been issued for many days, and the entire court was anxious. The Chen State originally had an army of 400,000 on the northwest border, and 100,000 participated in the battle to encircle and suppress the black barbarians on the grassland. They temporarily returned to the court to prepare for the reward, and only 300,000 were left. In the western region, regardless of the terrain, familiarly, the supply of food and grass, or the number of people, are not advantageous compared to the western regions that have been unified by Xiaoan. Xiaoan was lucky not to attack Chen. If Chen attacked Zioan, it would be self-destruction. However, His Majesty insisted on going his own way on this matter, completely ignoring the opinions of the courtiers, and even missing a single courtier. This caused complaints from officials in the DPRK and the central government, and an atmosphere of panic among the people continued to accumulate. Yangshen Temple, Emperor Chen smiled mockingly to himself, the Lord of Zioan, the Lord of Zioan, it's ridiculous, it's really ridiculous, my most trusted minister is actually the emperor of an enemy country, Wei Jian, do you think I'm a joke? Wei Jian stood behind him with his head lowered, motionless and making no sound, like a sculpture. Chen Wang's expression suddenly turned terrifying, and he gritted his teeth and said, he was the one who betrayed me first. I want him to know what happens to those who betray me. At this time, a figure hurriedly fell into the hall, rolled over and said in panic, Your Majesty, urgent report from the front line, 300,000 troops have been assembled in the western regions and have reached the border of our country, Chen State. Shazhu is in emergency. Fight, Emperor Chen said coldly, they came just in time. I will mobilize all the garrison troops from all over the place and kill these traitors at all costs. The man obviously hadn't finished speaking yet. He raised his head and said in a trembling voice, the Sushan people have assembled 100,000 troops and have crossed the Yin mountain. Shengzhou is in danger. Chen Huang turned pale, grabbed his collar, and said angrily, what did you say? Because they were both in the northwest, the war situation in Shengzhou and Grassland was reported at the same time. The simultaneous attacks in the western region and Grassland caused an uproar in the entire court, and the people were even more frightened. However, just one day later, the other two news when the news came, the hearts of the officials and people in the capital completely sank into the bottomless abyss. 100,000 troops from the Chu state appeared outside Fengzhou. They came with bad intentions, and the border between Chen and Chu was in danger. Ho Liang, who had never had any contact with Chen state, suddenly sent an army out of Yunnan. Wanzhou was in panic. The western regions, Grassland, Chu state, and Haoliang state all declared war on Chen state at the same time. Chen state has been surrounded and has nowhere to retreat. In the palace, Emperor Chen took the last urgent message, took a few steps back, and fell weakly on the chair. His whole body seemed to have been shaken from his spine, and he murmured, how could this happen? How could this happen? Fortunate young gentleman author, Rong Xiao Rong. Chapter 991. Not long after Chen state declared war on the western regions, Grasslands, Chu state, and Haoliang all declared war on Chen state at the same time. In a very short period of time, Chen state fell into a situation where it was besieged on all sides. There is no doubt that the cause of the series of events is Chen Guo's attitude towards the western regions. Chu state has a marriage alliance with the western regions, so it is not surprising that it would support the western regions. But since when did the Grassland and Haoliang establish such a close relationship with the western regions that they would not hesitate to declare war with Chen state for the sake of the western regions? Regardless of the reason, there is one fact that the people and officials of Chen state are well aware of. That is, Chen state has a little difficulty in dealing with the western regions, and it will definitely not be able to withstand the siege of the four countries. If the armies of the four countries cross the border, Chen state will be completely destroyed in less than a month. Their Chen country has reached the point of life and death. And all this is because today's emperor, regardless of the advice of the court officials and the opposition of the people, forcibly launched troops in the western regions. It is the people who suffer the consequences of the country's subjugation. This directly leads to the fact that before the court has come up with any countermeasures, the people have already exploded. The people spontaneously organized themselves and signed the letter of the people, requesting His Majesty to withdraw the order to attack the western regions and negotiate peace with the four countries. Negotiating peace is the general trend, and Chen Guo has to bow his head. If he does not bow his head, he will suffer the end of his country. The public discussion about this goes far beyond peace talks. There are even voices calling for His Majesty to abdicate in favor of others. Your Majesty, without his order, the Chen state would not have fallen into a situation where everyone in the world was the enemy. Nourish the temple. Chen Huang had been sitting on the chair for a day and a night, his face was haggard and his eyes were dull. What was placed on the table was the book of 10,000 people, which was submitted by the people of the capital, asking him to order the withdrawal of the troops. The tens of feet long silk was densely printed with the fingerprints of hundreds of thousands of people. Outside Yangshen Temple, hundreds of officials knelt on the ground and jointly petitioned him to withdraw his order to attack the western regions. In the hall, Wei Jian slowly walked over, carrying a bowl of soup, and comforted him, "Your Majesty, eat something. You haven't eaten for a whole day. My son has rebelled against me, my ministers have rebelled against me, and now even my true subjects must rebel against me." Emperor Chen did not look at the soup. He withdrew his eyes from the book of 10,000 people and asked in a low voice, "Could it be that is it really wrong?" Wei Jian put down the soup, was silent for a moment, and then said, "Yes, Your Majesty is wrong." Chen Huang raised his head and looked at Wei Jian slowly. This was the first time he heard such words from Wei Jian in the past decades. This was the first time he didn't follow his lead. "Even you think I'm wrong?" Emperor Chen asked in a hoarse voice. "Emperors are supposed to be ruthless. What's wrong with me doing this?" Wei Jian lowered his head and asked in a low voice, "If Your Majesty is not wrong, then what fault does His Highness King Huai have? If Your Majesty is not wrong, why do you often dream of the queen and concubine Yang, and ask for their forgiveness in your dreams? If the fight for the throne should be ruthless, then what's wrong with those officials kneeling outside? Isn't the current king run the same as His Majesty more than 20 years ago?" Wei Jian looked at him and said, "If Your Majesty didn't feel that he was at fault, how could he have lived so hard for so many years and been awakened by nightmares every night?" Emperor Chen lowered his head for a long time before sighing and said, "Brother, they want to kill me, and my father protects them. I don't regret using those methods to deal with them. The only thing I regret is that I am sorry for Roer and Xian'er. They are innocent, I failed them. I was really wrong." He sat on the chair with a gloomy expression. After a long time, he slowly raised his head and said, "Let Wang Xiang and others come in." After the atmosphere in the capital was extremely depressed for 2 days, news finally came out from the palace. A notice with His Majesty's jade seal was posted at the entrance of the palace. Every piece of news on the notice was earth-shattering. Nearly a month after declaring war on the western regions, His Majesty finally changed his focus and sent envoys to the western regions to negotiate peace. At the same time, the envoys to Chu, the grasslands, and Haoliang were also preparing to leave. In addition, the edict establishing Run Wang Zhaoyuan as the crown prince was finally issued today. After today, the young crown prince will supervise the country's administration and take charge of state affairs in place of His Majesty, who is ill. The people in the capital breathed a long sigh of relief. For them, there was not much difference whether King Zhong became emperor or King Run became emperor. As long as the 4 countries could withdraw their troops and stop invading Chen state, they would be satisfied. Of course, those with a discerning eye know that in this game between His Majesty and King Run and his officials, His Majesty finally took a step back. Although he is still the emperor in name, he no longer performs the duties of the emperor. The sentence that the prince oversees the country's administration and is in charge of state affairs explains everything. His Majesty's actions before establishing the crown prince almost plunged Chen Guo into eternal disaster. It is enough to show that he is no longer suitable to sit in that position. Although King Run is young, there are many capable ministers in the court. With their assistance, Chen Guo's the situation will definitely improve slowly. The letters of credence for the peace talks were rushed to Wanzhou, Shenzhou, Fengzhou and other places. When the news of the withdrawal of troops from various countries came from the front, the stone in everyone's heart finally fell. At this time, Tang Ning was standing at the gate of Runzhou city, holding a letter in her hand, and the expression on her face was particularly wonderful. After leaving the capital, they took a detour to Jiangnan and did not arrive in Runzhou until today. It was not until this moment that Tang Ning received the news from the capital. He just learned that after he left, Emperor Chen announced to send troops to the western regions. After the news spread, Chen was surrounded by Sushan, the western regions, Chu, and the later Liang. Even if Chen was powerful, it could not withstand the siege of the four countries. Under pressure, Emperor Chen sent envoys to negotiate peace, established Zhao Yuan as the crown prince, retreated behind the scenes, and no longer took care of court affairs. Since then, the court dispute in Chen has officially come to an end. King Huai's ultimate goal has been achieved, and the Fang family has also achieved its own goals. The series of disputes in the capital have finally come to an end. Fang Xinyu finished reading the secret letter in Tang Ning's hand, looked up at him, and asked in confusion, "Brother Tang Ning, our daddy and uncle, traitors?" Tang Ning did not give her an answer. Everyone has a different answer to this question. As for whether they are treacherous or loyal, it can only be left to future generations to judge. After a few years, with the efforts of Tang Yaoyao, Runzhou has become the back garden of the Tang family. Tang has long become a commercial giant in Jiangnan. Tang Ning found the shopkeeper who was in charge of the Runzhou store and asked him about the whereabouts of his parents. 2 months ago, the master and the lady left Jiangnan after the shopkeeper told him the news. He took out a letter from the box and handed it to Tang Ning, saying respectfully, "Before leaving, the master left a letter for you." They left. Tang Ning was stunned when he heard it. If the two of them had left Jiangnan, then they came here in vain this time. He opened the letter and saw only a piece of paper in the envelope with a line of words on it. "The world is so big, let's go and see it." Tang Ning was stunned for a while, and then a bitter smile appeared on his face. It seemed that they did not want to be disturbed by others in their world of two people. This trip to Jiangnan was destined to be in vain. At this time, the shopkeeper looked at him and asked with a smile, "Miss Tang Shui is still in Runzhou, do you want to meet her?"